Welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about Ssangsu Geombup Saban Form 4, Part 2. You know the spiel. At this point, they're just going to get shorter and shorter and shorter. So I'm wearing this uniform, not a Federation uniform, not because the forms are not canonical, but because the grand majority of my interpretations are not, right? So keep that in mind. So most of these ideas are going to be primarily my own, and if I take things from other sources, I generally try to say where they're from. So the first motion, right? So I'm going to be receiving some sort of attack. It's probably going to be either a stab or a crosscut according to two different interpretations. So whatever happens, I'm going to go back into my bomse as I pull the sword down, noticing the blade is essentially completely upright. The guard is about chin level, right? About jaw level, with the strong of the sword ideally kind of protecting my rib. Flip, cutting up underneath, aiming for the underside of the rib, even if they are wearing armor. So there's usually a slight dome to the side here. I could aim slightly below it, kind of try to get into the crook right there, right into their hip, right? Because there's usually a little bit of movement there with a turret, right? Hit up underneath, follow through, and then aiming obviously for the clavicle and drawing through with that second cut. So let's actually talk about this motion first. It has been said that this is blocking a crosscut, right? So a crosscut aiming for my rib. I'm pulling back using the strong of my sword to stop the momentum, flip it, and then have like the counter as you would anticipate it happening, right? So with the idea, there's a few nuances to make it work as best as you can, right? So I mentioned using the strong of the sword to really try to stop the momentum of the strike coming in, because if it doesn't, right? If I'm here and I hit a little bit lower, we have less power and leverage, you can imagine it's easy to blow through it and still hit me, right? Now, even if I do block with the strong, again, it's just going to potentially could just ricochet from here onto my hand, from here onto the mid, from here onto the weak, whatever might happen, right? So you have either a brief moment, if a moment at all, to react here, flip it, and counter. And again, you'll see later on in the video, a few complications happen when you try to do this live. The other interpretation is there's a thrust coming to me, specifically at the solar plexus. I would probably use a different block altogether to block something to my face, right? Just that's all you really need. Technically, you also just do this for the same effect against a thrust. But the idea is the flat of my sword is essentially riding onto the top of their upcoming thrust, using my curvature against their curvature, throwing it more down on an angle, and then coming in again for that same 1-2 counter. This is the one that I find works more often than the other one. It's a little bit more tricky to pull off, and they have to be like doing the right kind of motion. But of the two, I like this one a little bit more. So the first interpretation is we have a crosscut coming towards our rib. So if I see my opponent, I'm going to deflect it. Now notice I'm using the strong of my sword ideally against the mid of his sword. If I was way back here, right, first of all, it would be very easy to ricochet and just fall through and he can stab me. If I was way too close here, the next technique's not going to work and he can grapple me and cut me as such, right? The ideal case is as he gives me that cross, I'm here using, again, the strong and my strong to flip it up and over, and I'm going to aim for now the exposed rib, drawing up and down. Now, as you can see from the way the sword is kind of still there, this is a theoretical idea, at least in my interpretation. Because if he gives me that crosscut, and he really just wants me to die and he's just going to keep following through, I can't do much. I'm going to collapse in, and now he can easily cut me however he wants. I, in general, don't recommend this as a block for a crosscut. So as an alternative to that, if you give me that crosscut, coming in this way with my tip still honed in, if I want, I can just slide in, right, with the guard still kind of covering me as much as it can. Granted, he can still come up underneath this way. The ideal is using that guard to absorb as much as I can and just lean into that thrust. So, as a block to a crosscut, I recommend you attempt this for yourself, but let's talk about a different way. So, the way that I like to interpret this combination is a thrust is coming towards my solar plexus, right? As such, so if you really want to, you can just follow through. But the idea is, as that thrust is coming in, I'm going to come up and down, trying to, again, dislodge or at least disengage the sword so that I can come in. If I really want to be mean, I can aim low and aim for his leg, but I can still try to gain an advantage over a more vital area. Let's run through that combination a few times so you guys get an idea, right? It gives me that thrust, parry, up, and down, right? Now, ideally, you don't necessarily need to draw back too much here. So if you give me that same thrust, you can come in. I recommend coming up this way in the form of going that way. I'd recommend coming this way, so I'm kind of more, more away from him, have more geometry against him. The other motion is something we talked about before, right? So this is actually, I believe there was a part two in form 3, right? Where we have the 1, 2, and sliding in with that center cut, right? So the idea is using the core, using your hip. You can choose to use your pivot on that foot or not. But the idea is to engage more of your central muscles, be able to pivot and use it as a counter, and then use the momentum and the turning of your body to throw a little bit more power into that second cut, and then using the translation of your body, again, the movement of your body with that second cut to get a little more power, right? So using primarily your core and your glute for the 1, 2 follow up counter, and then we're going from here, get ready to do some fun stuff over here. But that's kind of like the extent of this one, right? So the idea is you could be receiving a center cut using the false edge of your sword to counter it this way. I could simply use this as a shield. Like if I know someone's there, I'm not sure where they are, and use this more as a powered up diagonal cut as opposed to an initial counter. So there's a lot of different ways you can interpret that kind of motion. But that's what we got, right? So these are generally pretty short forms, right? So form 4, I think, is one of the shortest ones just because it has specific chunks that it kind of plays with, as opposed to like having a whole slew of continuous motions, kind of like 2. Although 3 also has a very distinct bracket point. But that's what we have for today. So as usual, make sure you stay safe, stay humble, and keep training.